Welcome to FlightGlobal Focus, the essential podcast for trusted aviation insight. I'm Ryan Finnerty, FlightGlobal's America's defense reporter, and in today's show, military spending is surging across the world, even in countries with historically low outlays. Last month, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte released the alliance's annual report on defense spending by each of the 31 member states. The results show that historic laggards like Canada, Portugal, and Spain are now hitting NATO's target for spending 2% of GDP on defense. Across Europe and Canada, spending on major equipment procurement rose by 34%, with most members now meeting alliance goals for the purchase of new kit. Much of that spending is being directed towards new aircraft on both sides of the Atlantic. Here to break it all down with me is FlightGlobal's European defense editor, Craig Hoyle in London. Craig, good to speak with you again.
Hi, Ryan. It's good to be back after I missed our last episode about the excitement of Operation Epic Fury.
Yes, there's certainly been no shortage of news since then, and that was a great episode. So if anyone wants to go back and hear our analysis on the ongoing operations in the Middle East, just go back in the podcast feed and look for that episode between myself and our Asia editor, Greg Waldron. Okay, Craig, so as we mentioned, there's been a big run-up in defense spending over the past few years, driven in large part by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also by threats from U.S. President Donald Trump to not help European allies who he deems to be coasting on their security obligations. What stood out to you in this NATO spending report?
Yeah, so this is all about the NATO Secretary General's annual report, and that's a weighty 76-pager, which is packed with all sorts of fun stats and figures. So I compile our annual World Air Forces directory, so I'm not averse to wading through a big load of data. So at the sort of top line on this, the NATO estimate is that the alliance's combined defense spending went up last year to come in at just over $1.4 trillion, and that was up slightly from $1.3 trillion the year before. So spending is definitely on the rise. One of the key messages in this is that for the first time, all of the member states actually hit the baseline target for the first time. So that was set back in 2014, and it called for everyone to spend at least 2% of their gross domestic product or GDP on defense. It's taken a long time to get to this point. NATO is a bit like a supertanker turning when it comes to spending, but we've definitely seen a really big uptick since the war started in Ukraine in 2022. You mentioned in the intro it covers 31 nations. That might sound odd to people because NATO is a 32-nation alliance, but Iceland has no armed forces, so it's excluded. I think it's worth noting at the start that these are estimates for spending figures, and they're all given in 2021 dollar values, so some of the recent currency fluctuations don't really reflect in this. But there's a lot of notable stuff in this. So we said that everyone's hitting the 2% target, but it's notable that 5 of the nations are estimated at exactly 2%, and that's Albania, Belgium, Canada, Portugal, and Spain. And then another 8 are estimated at between 2 and 2.1%. So just sneaking in. And those are Croatia, Czech Republic, France, Hungary, Italy, Montenegro, Slovakia, and Slovenia. You mentioned in your intro there's a few sort of laggards, and I'd definitely add France among that list, which has a very large, capable military, but is only really, just getting over that 2% limit. But it's worth mentioning Germany, which, if you go back to 2014, its spending was 1.16%. Because of Ukraine, it's really upped its game, and it was at 2.39% last year. So there's a lot of percentages in here. It's worth also noting that the 2 most recent NATO entrants are already comfortably above the target. So Finland, which came in 2023, is at 2.87%, and Sweden, which joined a year later, is 2.5%. Yeah, so spending is on the up. So obviously there's been lots of noise coming out of Washington since President Trump returned to the White House, which has ranged from European nations being called freeloaders, more recently cowards for not backing the action in Iran, and sort of drawing into question whether NATO is going to have the US support that it needs going forward. So sort of rounding off the numbers, looking at the financial split. So Washington's spend last year was estimated $838 billion, which was 3.19% of its GDP. So the others, which was Europe and Canada, spent $574 billion. That makes it a 60-40 split. So NATO's figures reckon US should account for about 52% if you add all the GDPs together. So it's definitely paying more than its fair share. That can't really be disputed by anybody. But the balance is definitely shifting. So if you look back to the start of this review period in 2014, the rest spent 27% of the total. So it's gone from US paying 73% down to 60%. So moving in the right direction, definitely.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant shift. And quite a few of the countries you mentioned are set to spend even more. Canada in particular just put out a new defense industrial plan that really has some pretty significant increases for the next decade. And is that kind of what we expect to see in your part of the world, Craig, in Europe, that spending is going to continue to rise higher?
Yeah, absolutely. And what we saw last year, the NATO summit in The Hague, the nations agreed to go from this 2% figure that's been set over a decade ago to do the big jump, which is go up to 5%. That's a bit nuanced. So the 5% is actually 3.5% pure defense, and then the rest can be security, research and development, that sort of thing. So spending is going to go up a great deal more. The next NATO summit is in Ankara in July, and Secretary General Rutte said he expects allies to show they're on a clear and credible path towards the new target. So that was set to be done by 2035, and I think what we need is nations to be upping their spend much, much quicker than that due to the sort of global threat at the moment. So when they do meet in Ankara, there's 3 nations who are already on the good step. Latvia spent 3.74% last year, Lithuania 4%, and Poland, which is out in front at 4.3%. So no coincidence at all. Those are among the countries who are closest to Russia geographically. And Rutte describes Russia as the most significant and direct threat to security, peace, and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. So we know where the threat is coming from. If you look at Poland as an example, it's having a major modernization drive. So procurements it's got ongoing include 32 Lockheed Martin F-35 stealth fighters, 96 Boeing H-64E Apache attack helicopters, and 48 Korea Aerospace Industries FA-50 trainer and light attack aircraft. It's already fielded second-hand Saab 340 airborne early warning aircraft. It wants to buy tankers, and those are important to support not only the F-35s coming in, but its current Lockheed F-16s. So Poland is spending really big. One other bit I'd sort of seize on from the NATO report is, in addition to the GDP target, there's a key metric that nations have to spend at least 20% of their expenditure on equipment purchases. Pretty much everybody is above that. So last year, Albania, Belgium, and Estonia were below. Everybody else was above. And going up to the top of that list, you've got Hungary and Poland, and then a bit of a weird outlier, Luxembourg at 55%. Luxembourg's got one A400M transport that it operates with Belgium. So that kind of makes its figures look a bit strange. The one bit that doesn't really come through from the figures is I don't know what degree things are skewed by allies buying equipment to give to Ukraine. So there's a new mechanism called PEARL, the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List. And they're able to buy kit directly from the US and then divert it onto Kyiv. That has a particular emphasis on air defense equipment, so not so relevant for us on the aircraft side. Yeah, so people are spending big. I'm going to make a bit of a tenuous link at this point now. So one of the future requirements that NATO has is to replace its Boeing E-3 AWACS surveillance aircraft. And that type has been thrust really strongly into the spotlight due to action in the Middle East. So exactly 1 month into Operation Epic Fury, we had a US Air Force AWACS destroyed on the ground in Saudi Arabia. Perhaps it's a good opportunity, Ryan, tell us what you know about that so far. And also, to me, it feels a bit reminiscent of the Ukrainian spiderweb raid on Russian bases last year. Is that a sort of fair comparison to consider?
Yeah, I think so, Craig. I actually had the same thought when I saw the news about this attack that happened at an airbase in Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned. And for those who may not remember, Operation Spiderweb was the 2025 clandestine intelligence operation put together by the Ukrainians, where they smuggled more than 100 remotely piloted quadcopter drones deep in Russia across these 3 air bases. And the drones were used to strike more than a dozen Russian Tupolev strategic bombers, and notably one of Russia's own Beriev A-50 AWACS aircraft. So there's an extra added link there between the AWACS. In Saudi, as part of this ongoing U.S.-Israeli war with Iran, we did see an E-3 was hit in somewhat of a similar fashion. We don't know the exact details. They haven't been as publicized as the details of Operation Spiderweb were. But as you wrote in your piece for the website, it looks very much like the aircraft was struck with a one-way attack drone. There's sort of very localized damage to one portion of the fuselage where the radome is, and the rest of the aircraft is sort of intact, although clearly non-functional and likely never will be again, because the damage to the one portion that was struck is quite severe. We haven't really gotten official confirmation from the Pentagon as to that this actually happened, but the photos seem quite authentic. They've been shared on some social media pages that are known for getting leaks from kind of lower ranking junior U.S. military personnel on the ground, not always tactical details like this. Sometimes it's more gossip from within the services, but they have a good track record of accuracy for these type of things. So it seems like it is legitimate. We also know from some commercial satellite photos that were distributed by a Chinese company, a Chinese private intelligence company in the lead up to the war, that there were at least 6 E-3s stationed in Saudi Arabia. And we had a big feature on that at the beginning of March when Operation Epic Fury kicked off. And you can go back online and read that and see satellite photos of the E-3s along with some other strategically significant aircraft that were included in part of that buildup. So yeah, as you mentioned, the question is sort of where does both NATO and the US and other member states go from here when it comes to AWACS? This is a very important battlefield function. You need both airborne management of tactical aircraft. So that's one key function of AWACS. They kind of direct traffic, and they can also use that big, powerful radar to direct weapons shots, and they can reach much farther out than the fire control radars on smaller fighter aircraft. But they also identify incoming threats and kind of cue those fighters to respond, whether to interdict or to take a shot, and track those threats from the air. Those are both really important functions, and they're very much needed. And as you mentioned, NATO was planning to replace its own fleet of E-3s, which are, I think, some of the only kit that the actual alliance headquarters owns and operates itself. They're crewed by personnel from the member states, but the alliance actually owns them, versus most NATO equipment is actually owned by the sovereign governments. So NATO had this plan to replace its fleet of E-3s with the newer Boeing E-7 Wedgetail, which is kind of a more modernized version of the Cold War era E-3. That's in service or about to be in service with the UK Royal Air Force. Australia has been using the E-7 for about a decade now, including some combat service in the Middle East and on NATO's eastern flank. Although Australia is not a NATO member, they've kind of assisted with some air policing since the Russia-Ukraine war began, using the E-7, and also in service with South Korea. So there had been this plan to buy E-7s, but there was sort of a bump in the road when the Trump administration in Washington said that they actually didn't like the E-7. They didn't think it was survivable and didn't want to buy an expensive and potentially vulnerable aircraft, as they described it. They said it wasn't survivable. We're seeing some evidence of that with the E-3 in the Middle East now, and suggested that they would move to a space-based alternative for doing the AWACS missions. Everyone I've talked to said, while that is theoretically possible, there is no available solution for that. It's new technology and new systems that would need to be developed, new operational concepts that would need to be tested and rolled out. So in the short term, we're sort of betwixt and between. The US is begrudgingly moving forward with its E-7 prototyping program under a mandate from lawmakers in Congress, even though the Pentagon doesn't really want to. So there's 2 US E-7s that are, we believe, have arrived in the UK in Birmingham to undergo modifications, where the Royal Air Force's E-7s are being fitted out with their mission systems. And so we'll see what happens. But NATO appears to have walked away from its E-7 procurement, citing concerns about cost and mission suitability. If the US doesn't believe in its own system, those E-7s are made by Boeing, an American company. And so now it seems as if NATO will maybe explore a European option for AWACS, likely something from Saab. And that's something you've written quite a bit about, Craig. Where do you think NATO's going to go with its E-3 replacement?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, because I think when self-styled Secretary of War Pete Hegseth said that E-7 wasn't wanted because it's not survivable, you sort of raise your eyebrows and think, well, I guess when you think, China with J-20 and long-range missiles, that's the threat. Whereas, the clearer threat here is the threat to the aircraft while it's sitting on the ground at a base, which may have Patriot missile batteries there to protect it. But against something like drone target, very, very difficult to protect. I've seen lots of coverage with people saying there should be sort of revetments or berms between the aircraft to protect them. But as we saw with the Ukrainian operation, you just send multiple drones and pick off individual aircraft. So really difficult to protect this sort of technology. There was also a suggestion at the start of the campaign that the Iranians might have hit one of the UAE's GlobalEye aircraft in a hangar, but I've no idea if that was complete nonsense from the Iranians or it had any truth to it. Regarding Europe, UK's got its first Wedgetail coming into use later this year. It should hit initial operational capability. We're only getting 3 aircraft here. We've had no airborne early warning fixed wing capability for about 5 years since our AWACS went. So it's going to be interesting to see what capability that brings, and also how we cope with a 3 aircraft fleet, because you would typically expect 1 aircraft to maybe be deployed, 1 to support training, and 1 to maybe be in maintenance. So it's a very light capability we will have individually. For NATO itself, yeah, so NATO went cold on Wedgetail after the US sort of went decidedly lukewarm on it. And you mentioned cost. I think the 2 prototypes for the USAF are going to cost about $5 billion. So it's an eye-watering amount of money for 2 prototypes. Yeah, so Europe and NATO, Sweden is buying GlobalEyes. It's previously suggested it could do a sort of joint Nordic capability with Finland, with Denmark potentially. So they've done an idea that they could use those as a sort of shared fleet operating around Europe. If you went for a like-for-like replacement, so one of the things NATO needs of its AEW aircraft is 360-degree coverage. You don't have that on GlobalEye at the moment. It has an ER radar mounted atop the fuselage in a ski box configuration, the Swedes call it. So it's side-looking. Saab have a way of making it a 360-degree capability. So I think that's definitely of interest. They've also been aggressively marketing that to Canada. GlobalEye is based on a Bombardier Global 6500 business jet. So I definitely see potential for more nations to be looking at GlobalEye, and good for Europe, good for Canada. And this is perhaps one of the side effects of President Trump's attitude to European NATO, that on some of these procurements, they may now say, well, hang on a minute, we might not just buy Boeing or just follow the USAF. We might do our own thing. So let's wait and see. NATO programs move quite slowly. So it's probably going to be way beyond President Trump's turn by the time we work out what's following AWACS here. But definitely a very interesting one to keep an eye on.
Yeah, that's a good point, Craig. I had a similar thought when the news of NATO walking away from its E-7 procurement hit. And I'm sure there's some truth to it being prompted by concerns about the sort of U.S. lack of confidence in the platform. But I did wonder how much of that was kind of a smokescreen to pivot towards a European platform and sort of capitalize on this increasing sentiment to buy European amongst the European NATO members. So I think it does seem likely at this point that that's the direction they're going to go, whatever the reason may be. And, I think it really does, though, whichever platform gets fielded, it still doesn't address the vulnerability of these types of numerically scarce but very strategically important large aircraft on the ground. And I was really stunned, I think, to see the destruction of the E-3 in Saudi Arabia after the U.S. Air Force has made so much noise over the past 3 to 4 years about distributed operations and this, concept they call agile combat employment, where aircraft are going to operate from many small airfields and we're not going to rely on fixed bases anymore. And that's how we're going to survive on the ground, which we're now seeing is where aircraft are the most vulnerable in this era of long range precision strike. And to me, it was really, really kind of shocking that the U.S. Air Force just seems to have not even attempted to do that in the Middle East. I mean, they are operating from a number of bases around the region as far away as Israel, and of course, long range sorties by bomber aircraft from North America and bases in the UK. Those platforms are safe, but within the Middle East, they're still kind of defaulting to a small number of really large bases that are well within strike range of the Iranians. And as you mentioned, these small one-way attack drones are difficult to detect and intercept when you can fire them in such large numbers, and they're quite small and slow moving, and it just requires a different scheme of air defense that it seems like the U.S. Air Force knew would be an issue. I've heard many of the generals talk about it a lot over the past few years, but they seem to be really struggling to actually shift the maybe organizational mindset around sortie generation and maybe air-based defense. What's your read on it, Craig? You've been on this beat a lot longer than I have.
Yeah, I mean, ACE and its sort of equivalents have been around for a long time, and UK context. So way back to doing operations in Afghanistan, we would put tanker aircraft in Oman and you just fly a further distance because you don't have the local basing, and it's just keeping them safe from any sort of local threat. The drone threat has completely changed that. And you say even a base in the UK. So we've got B-52s and B-1Bs flying out of RAF Fairford. Ukraine showed that things could be done with trucks with drones. So, even back at bases like that, they're being vigilant about potential threats. Difficult with a concept like ACE. We all think about it as F-16s and Gripens landing on little road strips. Obviously, you can't do that with tankers and big ISR assets like AWACS. So they are always going to be a bit isolated and a bit at risk. But then I think it shows up some of your day-to-day practices of, the Chinese are taking satellite images. So do you always park the aircraft in the same spot on the ramp? Do you move things around? They will definitely have to learn lessons from this. And I think they will just have to sort of think themselves lucky if they've lost an AWACS and damage to a couple of tankers, possibly. It could have been a lot worse. If they'd sent in 30, 40 aircraft, you could be talking about much bigger destruction. So there's no easy way to protecting things on the ground. Aircraft will get smarter. So something like a Global Eye, you can have towed decoys on it. You can have electronic warfare on it. So it can help it against airborne threats. Yeah, sitting on the ground, these assets are always going to be very vulnerable. They're worth an awful lot of money. They take many, many years to build and deliver. So if you lose part of your fleet it's a real problem. So I think USAF is now down to 16 E-3s after a load of retirements. They did have 31 at the start of the decade, and that already looks a bit concerning that that's a bit of a small fleet now. So, yeah, I think lessons will definitely be learned, but whether they can move things about, move them further out of theatre and bring them in with tankers maybe, that all depends on, are your allies supporting you? And we've seen with this campaign, some of the allies in NATO don't want any part of this Iran campaign, so won't support this sort of deployment. So they're kind of stuck with where they are, and they'll just have to up their game a bit on the defences, I think.
Yeah, all great points, Craig. It really seems like there's no easy answer to this problem. And as you mentioned, no quick solution either, with E7 production at least a decade out, it seems like, into the 2030s for fielding a real fleet. You had mentioned the other day, maybe they will try and restore some aircraft that have been retired and put in storage and plus up the fleet a little bit. So that's definitely something we'll be watching as the next year's budget negotiations begin in Washington, to see if there's any discussion of maybe restoring some retired E3s from the boneyard in Arizona, if that's something that would even be possible, depending on how they've been stored. But that will be an issue for another day. And unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. So thanks so much, Craig. It's been great to speak with you, and we'll talk again soon.
Yeah, cheers until next time. Let's see what the next few weeks bring for our next conversation.
You have been listening to Flight Global Focus, which is a production of Flight Global with audio editing by Lucy Johnson. If you want to get in touch with us or for commercial opportunities related to the podcast, please email podcast@flightglobal.com. Listen, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And please join us again next week for more in-depth analysis covering the latest developments in airlines, defense, and aerospace. I'm Ryan Finnerty, and we'll see you next time for Flight Global Focus.